The excitement around the OPTIMISMM trial was built on the fact that it's a very large phase 3 study comparing the triplet of pomalidomide, bortezomib and dexamethasone to a control group of bortezomib and dexamethasone in 1 to 3 prior therapies. And it builds on the synergy that we have come to recognize between proteasome inhibitors and IMiDs that's well established with RVD, carfilzomib, lenalidomide and dexamethasone, ixazomib, lenalidomide and dexamethasone. And combinations with pomalidomide using proteasome inhibitors are now widely used in US practice, particularly in the relapse setting. The goal of this study, however, was to, in a very organized fashion, to explore what actually the benefit might be of the 3-drug combination over the 2 in the context of lenalidomide exposure. So the goal here was to ensure that all patients were lenalidomide exposed, and after lenalidomide treatment had run out of its benefit for each patient, they would then come onto this trial to further clarify exactly what the benefit of the 3 drugs versus the 2 would be in such a setting. So this was an international study run across multiple countries, multiple centers, and basically in this context we looked at 1 to 3 prior regimens. 70% of the patients were truly lenalidomide refractory. The remaining 30% had been lenalidomide exposed, but were not truly refractory at the time of coming onto treatment. What was particularly promising in terms of the results, we saw a PFS difference overall by intent to treat that was approximately 4.5 months in favor of the 3 drugs over the 2. But what was particularly striking was in the patients who had had 1 prior therapy and were in first relapse, the PFS difference was quite remarkable at around over 10 months. It was 20 months versus around 11 for the control group. And that's important because it tells us that the clinical benefit from the triplet was quite significant in that group of patients. It also, of course, was broadly significant across all groups of patients, but particularly in those folks. An important part of the trial to share with everyone is that continuous therapy was part of the study design for both arms. So there wasn't a pre-specified conclusion to treatment. What there was 8 cycles of PVD, 8 cycles of bortezomib and dexamethasone, and then after cycle 9, a maintenance strategy followed. So as a result of that, I think these are very real-world type results in showing a benefit in favor of the 3 drugs over the 2. It's worth mentioning that the response rate overall for the 3 drugs was about 82%. But in the patients who had had 1 prior therapy, it was actually north of 90%. And that was encouraging, with high quality responses seen as well. Now in terms of tolerability, generally speaking, the combinations were well tolerated in both arms. It's fair to say there was more neutropenia encountered with the pomalidomide, bortezomib, dex, as you would expect. But the rate of febrile neutropenia was actually low at just 3%, so generally manageable. There was also slightly more peripheral neuropathy for the 3 drugs over the 2, but having said that, that too was generally manageable. And there was certainly no significant adverse events that were unexpected or particularly unusual. And in that regard, it's worth noting that rates of thromboembolism for both arms were very low. So that was all, I think, encouraging in terms of a tolerability profile, but the efficacy data obviously were our focus of this first presentation of this information, because obviously the primary endpoint had been met.
Okay, and when can we expect overall survival? What's the timeline here?
Well, that's a great question. The overall survival data is probably going to take a while to mature because, as you know, now, thank goodness, in myeloma we have multiple regimens that we can use for patients in relapse, and so be in a position to really, derive benefit for each successive line of therapy that's needed for any particular patient. So, in that context, survival data may take a while to mature. Having said that, the PFS difference is quite striking, so one would expect to see a survival difference potentially become more apparent in a few years. I think it's important to mention that other endpoints included quality of life, duration of response, and a variety of surrogates, and those analyses are all ongoing.
And just to double check, was there any crossover between the arms?
No, there wasn't. Both arms were stratified by risk factors and cytogenetics, ISS stage and so forth, a number of prior therapies. And what we saw was that in fact in the 3-drug group there was a consistent benefit across all subgroups pre-specified in the study. Obviously when a patient relapsed on the control arm, bortezomib and dexamethasone, they could have access to whatever was best therapy available. And in our own patients, and we were the lead enroller in the United States, for our patients, obviously we offered pomalidomide-based therapy typically, upon the recurrence of disease and the need to treat. I think it just reflects another very important phase 3 trial in a very particular space, which is those patients in whom lenalidomide treatment has run out of benefit. And I emphasize that because, in fact, in the same area, the phase 3 trials that have been largely done have been very important and very informative. But it's important for everyone to know they don't necessarily include a large number of lenalidomide exposed or refractory patients. This is the first of its kind in that regard.